Afternoon and welcome to this GIRI forum. This is the second in a series of 3 spring or summer forums dedicated to thought-provoking ideas about getting it right in design, and this is an interactive session, so please get ready to contribute with your thoughts and comments. I'm pleased to be joined today by Nick Francis, who is Education Director at our training arm GTC, and Diana Osmolska, a researcher at the University of Manchester. I'm going to give a short introduction about GIRI for those of you who are less familiar with us, and then hand over to Nick to lead the session. On the housekeeping front, can I ask you to mute your microphones if not speaking, but remember to turn back on in the breakout sessions and if invited to ask or answer a question. If you don't mind, please leave your videos on, because that way we feel the meeting has more vitality. And if any questions come to mind as we go through, please use the chat box and Nick will try and pick up these during the panel discussions or at the end. And if you have any tech problems, well, we adopt the usual IT support tactic: turn off and try again, i.e. leave the meeting and then rejoin using the same link. So many of you may be familiar with GIRI to some extent, but I think it's worth just reflecting on some key points about the origins of our thinking and our key messaging. In 2016, we carried out research into the cost of error in construction, and the results showed how much waste was caused by error: 21% of turnover. There's a direct cost of 5%. That's pretty much what you see on NCRs and reports from site. The indirect cost, this is the impact on third parties with their time and disruption delay costs. Unrecorded process waste is where things go wrong but are put right and no records are made, and latent defects are 3%, which occur after handover. So the figure may be a bit higher, a bit lower, but it's a lot of money. So it's a no-brainer that we need to do something about it. GIRI was established following the original research as a not-for-profit membership-based organisation with the strategic aim of improving industry productivity through the elimination of error, and we became a limited company in 2017. The research demonstrated the link between error elimination and productivity, and this helped to convince businesses in the industry as to the benefits of investing in a zero-error programme. But the world is changing, and boardrooms are now recognising the broader range of imperatives that they need to satisfy, including safety, sustainability and quality. And we've been able to show that an error-free strategy provides a platform for achieving all these objectives, and our strategic aim now reflects this. So without further ado, let's just say that we need to get the right culture throughout the industry so that people feel empowered to act in ways which reduce error. And this benefits the industry, the companies in the industry, and improves our reputation. We need to change that behaviour now. So let's hear from Nick. Over to you, Nick. Are you there? I can't hear you.
Oh, there we go. There was the first boo-boo of the day. Thanks, Cliff. That's great. Really nice to see you all. As Cliff mentioned, if you can turn your cameras on, that would be great, because it's always nice to see human beings out there. So what we're going to do today, I'll just share my screen. Hopefully I'll have that ability. Here we go. So the outline for today's session is that we are going to start off by wondering, what is the difference between managing construction and managing design? We're then going to refer back to something we have learned already from the GIRI design guide. We're going to have a look at the idea of opening up and closing down, so 2 different ways of thinking. We're then going to look at a number of questions. We're going to say, how do we learn from the past when it comes to design? How do we allow new ideas into the way we do things? How do we pick the best options when we're designing? How do we get feedback? And therefore, what does this mean for your projects? Now, I'm joined today, thankfully, by Diana Osmolska. Now, Diana is a PhD researcher in architecture at the University of Manchester, and her work focuses specifically on helping designers to make decisions that result in fewer errors. So it's how do designers make decisions is her specialist area. And that has a real focus on cognitive psychology, which hopefully we'll just be able to dip into today. So she's going to add a real depth to what we're covering. So my first question then, and I'm going to throw this out to the audience, is what is the difference between managing construction and managing design? So a lot of us might be quite familiar with managing construction, but I want to know what is different about managing construction and managing design. So I will stop sharing my screen. I'll have to remember that question for a few seconds. And if you can please go down to the bottom of your screen and find the chat box. It's normally bottom right, and I never know if these are reversed. I think it's down there. So if you can please type in, what do you think is different about managing design from managing construction? And I'll ask a few of you to speak if you've got any suggestions. So here we go. Everyone's typing away. Who's going to get there? Haven't got any responses yet. There we go. Okay, so Douglas, that's interesting. You said designers have a different insight, so need managing differently. So maybe I can ask you to expand on that, Douglas.
You want to speak?
Yes, please. Yeah, to speak. Yeah.
That's embarrassing because I put the statement there without really knowing what I'm talking about. But I think that they are a very different breed. So constructors, in my mind, they often have a lot more in terms of practical skills. They're almost at the cold face. They are on site, and I suppose actively involved in the construction process. Whereas designers, sometimes they tend to be in a bit of an ivory tower, far removed from the construction process. They're focused on compliance with standards and interpretation of the various laws and regulations. They also probably have a much closer relationship directly with the client.
Okay, interesting. So it sounds like you're saying that they are the different characteristics of the people involved and a slightly different role as well.
I would say so. So not better, just different.
Okay.
So I think that's really important to stress. And then, of course, the best people are the ones who have put in both camps, who have actually done the construction, then they've moved on to design or vice versa.
Great. Okay, and we've got two comments here. We've got one from Matt Castle that says design is original thought, and then Dr. J. Martin, creativity is key. So maybe can I come to Dr. J. Martin? Could you talk about that creativity, the intellectual service? Could you just expand on that for us, possibly, please?
Glad to meet you. I've been active in different associations, which are umbrella associations on European level and also FIDIC on a worldwide level, and they are very much against submitting these design bids and being treated only as commodity. So it's really about the role the designer has and how much trust he or she is enjoying from the client. And during recent years, we saw the trust of the clients decreasing, clients believing that design is also a commodity like construction, whereas FIDIC and also EFCA stress the fact that we want to be seen as a trusted advisor by the clients. And this is also a difficult role towards the contractor, because the more we are a partner of the contractor, the less we are perhaps the trusted advisor of the client. So the roles are different. And
Really
managing the expectation of the client is different, I think, depending how much design the contractor has on his side.
Okay, so there's some real interesting stuff to try and unpackage there. You mentioned several times about the idea of trust and that relationship with the client, and also the idea of it being a commodity. So that sounds like something really important for us to start to get our heads around. I'll just pick up on one more point from Zhao B, who says risks are managed differently. Maybe can I ask you to just expand on that? What's your comment on the different ways we manage risk?
It's vaguely related also with my predecessor's opinion, because that trust is managed differently. Risks will follow. What I mean by this is usually designers' errors have a different sort of impact than construction errors, and we only found out sometimes that we have issues on our design on a later stage, and I think the contracts that we apply to design and construction are different, also because they reflect this need. We at Gatwick, where I work, we tend to put a lot of incentivizations and a lot of degree of thoroughness in the contracts with the contractors, with the designers, because maybe there is that trust, maybe because we see them as reliable and our advisors. We tend to be softer in those demands, and usually we don't put as much complexity for them to produce their outputs, and maybe that's also something that reflects the level of risk that we end up talking about.
Interesting. Okay, so and you sort of alluded there as well to the proximity of consequence. How close are you to the consequence of your decisions?
Absolutely.
And Richard, yeah, thank you. And Richard, I'll just let Richard Watson come in. You wanted to make a comment on the risk. Oh, I think you're muted, Richard. There we go. I think you might still be muted. Can we? Maybe if you try pressing the space bar, that sometimes works. Oh no, I think we might be denied your comment. I'll tell you what, Richard, we still can't hear you. What I'd suggest is if you can type your comment in the box, that way we'll be able to keep a record of it, and also everybody can read those comments in the box. So I think that's probably the best way for us to keep going. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, please do have a read through those comments. I've only picked out a few, so I definitely haven't picked out everything that should be picked out. There's some really interesting initial thought. So I'll just share my screen again, and just to hopefully reflect on some of the comments, not at the same depth as was covered just then, but just thinking about some of the fundamental difference between managing construction and managing design. So obviously managing construction, we should have an end state defined. So there should be a design that says this is the end state. So our challenge in managing construction is to get to the end state as quickly, safely, cheaply, efficiently as we can. Whereas managing design, we know, is fundamentally different because the end state is not defined. So the objective is to get to the right end state. So it's a very different challenge to knowing what the end state is and getting there as quickly and efficiently as you can, to working out where are we going. So they are fundamentally different. Now, what this can do is, if we apply the techniques that we use for managing construction to managing design, all of those tools are aimed at getting us to the end cheaply and quickly. We can sort of think of this maybe a bit like walking up a hill. You know, what we're trying to do is get to the top of the hill. We can see the top of the hill. We're trying to get there as quickly as we can. So if we're managing construction, our challenge is to go up that hill as quickly as we can. But what that doesn't do is confirm whether or not we're going up the right hill at all. You know, is there a better option? So when we think about managing design, we've got this challenge of actually not just racing as fast as we can up the hill, but also trying to confirm if we're going up the right hill. Now, this is only touching slightly on some of the issues that we've already brought out, but I'm just going to explore this idea of not only going up the hill as fast as you can, but also making sure you're going up the right hill. Now, in the design guide, the GIRI design guide, there are 12 themes, characteristics of good design, and one of these is this idea of opening up and closing down. Now, the idea of opening up and closing down is that you have to have a variety of ideas. You have to open up and have lots of ideas before you can start picking the ones you choose, closing down to your solution. So we can sort of draw this as a bit of a diagram. Say, if we're trying to find the best solution, we need to have lots of different ideas. And then from all of the ideas, we start picking the best options. So that's what we do when we design. We try and open up, come up with lots of ideas and close down and pick the best ones. So when we're picking the best ideas, what we're doing is we're proving that things work and we rule them in. And this is what certainly structural engineers like me and a lot of consultants are very good at, is they're proving whether something works, optimizing a solution. But there's this earlier bit of having ideas where we have to only rule things out if we know they don't work. Now, this is a challenge because a lot of built environment professionals are very, very good at closing down and saying, right, that works. That's how we optimize it. But this first part of having more ideas can feel very, very uncomfortable because you're essentially working away from a defined solution. It feels like you're getting more chaotic, you're adding more confusion, you're getting further away from the end state. It doesn't feel like you're walking up the hill. You might be walking around the hill or even downhill, which we don't like doing. Now, some of you will notice this sort of picture and say, what we're doing is we're trying to carry forward ideas that worked before, but we're also adapting to the new situation we find ourselves in. And of course, in the built environment, every project is going to be slightly different. Even two projects that look similar, there's going to be elements that make one project different from another. So we're constantly trying to adapt to the new situation we're in from project to project. And this is something that happens around us all the time. And this is what Darwin talks about in his theory of evolution by natural selection, whereby you have lots of options and the best option is selected and the best option is the one that survives. Now, if we look at evolution, we identify that there are a number of things that have to be in place for evolution to happen. So the first thing is we need heredity. Now that means that you inherit stuff that works from a previous generation. Good ideas, stuff that works is brought forward. It's not just complete chaos. Now, every time a child is born, it's not just a completely different thing. It carries forward what worked for its parents. But we also have to have variance. Otherwise, it would just all be clones. So you have a little bit of change. And that's where all of the different options appear. You then have to have some appropriate selection. What is it that chooses which ideas get carried forward and which ideas don't? And finally, you have to have many, many, many generations for things to evolve. Evolution doesn't happen in a single generation. It happens over thousands of generations. So you have to have repetition of this happening again and again and again. So a little bit obscure in that we're talking about biology, but I think it's interesting just to look at these four headings. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw this back to all of you and just want to look at that first element, heredity, where we carry forward ideas that have worked before and bring them into new projects. So my question is, how do we achieve heredity in our design processes? So, what is it that means things that have worked before get carried forward into new projects? So I will stop sharing my screen and please type in your answer. What do you think helps us have heredity, helps us bring ideas that have worked before into new projects? see what we've what brings forward successful ideas into new projects. Okay, Martin, so you've mentioned regulations and standards. Can you maybe give any examples of where you've seen that or how that works?
Pressure equipment directives, things like that, about how we build vessels. There's a common one we're working to. Lola, about lifting, how you design systems and build safety margins into it. There's quite across the whole industry, really, in many industries. There's practices that are carried out in the past, which are standardized, and it can be used for people coming on in the future.
Okay, and I think we're all very familiar with design codes and regulations. Great, thank you. And Douglas, you've mentioned about a copy and paste mentality. And you've linked that to risks. Maybe you can just tell us about that.
If you have a risk-averse client or a risk-averse consultant, they will instinctively use the tried and trusted principles that have always worked before, and that the insurance companies and other bodies are happy with. And also, I think there's a great advice. I've called it the copy and paste mentality. But if you need to get something out quickly, then there's probably no substitute for trying what you tried last time, as long as it worked.
Interesting. So it's sort of safe, isn't it, to do the same as before? You know, it's going to be more or less right. I'm just going to come to one from Robert as well. You said you've mentioned a few things there, Robert. Specialist subcontractors, case studies, LinkedIn. Maybe you can expand on those, please.
Yeah, just ones that I've sort of probably referred to in the past. A supply chain that have tackled similar projects and got a wealth of experience in certain areas that they can bring to a main contractor and guide as to
Interesting.
how to tackle a problem.
Yeah, so it sounds like you almost have to go fishing for these things as well. Go and find the person who's done it before, or go and find the case studies.
Yeah, and I think as an industry, we're quite, if something has gone wrong previous, we're quite, it embeds in the memory and we quickly write it off, whereas that's not always the right thing to do.
Interesting. Okay, I'm sure we'll come back to that. So the second question I want to ask is sort of the opposite, which is how do we achieve variance in our design processes? So how do we introduce new ideas? And again, if you can just type your answers in the box, please, that would be great. How do we allow new ideas into our design processes? So we've got embrace innovation. Okay, we need more exemplar projects from clients who are willing to be able to push boundaries and try new things. Research from Cliff, encouraging value discussions. Oh, that sounds interesting. Russell, maybe can you expand on that? Encouraging value discussions and innovation.
Yeah, I think on some projects, there's, especially the big complex major projects, there's an opportunity quite early on to really sort of challenge what's been presented, and with the right sort of facilitator involved that really understands sort of value engineering and value management, you can really explore that idea of doing more with less and really understanding are the typical solutions you have out there the right solutions. And you can sort of break things into component parts, understand what the client's actually after, outcomes, requirements, etc., and approach things in a different way. But actually having that as almost like a sort of a stage quite early on in the design process is good to sort of facilitate that. It's kind of like you're opening up, I suppose, quite early on, isn't it? Challenging the brief, challenging what's there.
Great. So coming out loud and clear that early is where these opportunities sit. And we've had a few similar comments. We talked about brainstorming, and if we think about brainstorming, that is lots of stuff that's very much opening up. And we've also got a comment about listening to stakeholders. So actually allowing other people to contribute sounds like it's a really important part. Quite a few really interesting comments in the chat box there. So I hope you're all able to read those. I like that one from Zhao again. Start with maybe. be willing to change or challenge the current status quo. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to hand over to Diana. And if you remember, the third of our questions was, so we talked about heredity, how do we carry forward ideas? We talked about variance, how do we allow new ideas in? And so what Diana's going to start exploring for us is, how do we select? So if we've got ideas, how do we pick our ideas? So I'll hand over to you, Diana, and I really look forward to hearing what you've got to say. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, Nick. So I'll share with you my presentation so we can get started. So like Nick described earlier, I'm interested in early design process. And at the beginning of the design process, when you're still trying to work out the feasibility of a construction process, the design problems are quite undefined. You don't know what the design problem is. You have a brief, but you're also not quite sure whether this outline problem will work. And to explore the kind of what can sit on a given site, what can we develop, quite often the designers start by developing solutions and saying, well, is this solution going to sit okay in this site? Is it possible? What do we need to gather? What are the problems? And this iterative process repeats until an idea is chosen that kind of marries the problem and the solution together. And what I found puzzling is that quite often there is an assumption that designers know that they still haven't quite figured out whether this given project is feasible on this site. And they also know when they need to gather more information, when they need to redevelop the brief, speak to the client, and they also know when they reach the point that their solution is okay and they can develop, if ever, take it into design development. So I wanted to find out, well, what causes a designer to be satisfied? What causes a designer to select that solution, in Nick's words? And what prompts the designer to look for additional information? And to do that, I drew on cognitive psychology, which assumes that we all possess two types of thinking. Type 1, which is quick, intuitive, efficient, and type 2, which is slow, deliberate, effortful. And this thinking gets kind of, which one gets deployed depends on the feeling of rightness. So a quick example is 2 + 2 is 4. We all know that, and it also feels right. This is what I mean by the feeling of rightness. It feels right. Whereas if I say 2 + 2 is 5, all of a sudden you have a very low feeling of rightness. You feel like it's wrong, and you want to deliberate and spend a bit of effort, or maybe just think why it is wrong. And to kind of use this theory, I wanted to explore what happens during these initial stages, and I interviewed architects and asked them to talk through these initial stages from the beginning to the end. And these architects varied in their experience, positions within the company. And I wanted to explore the traces of this kind of thinking present in their descriptions. And what I found out, which is probably quite obvious, is that the characteristics of the initial design stages, initial design decisions, is that there is lack of information. And the reason why there's lack of information is because quite frequently you don't have the funds to be able to spend a lot of time doing analysis, and you don't have the funds to go and ask for surveys, because quite often you still don't know whether this project is feasible. So a lot of the decisions are based on assumptions and caveats, and this leads to potentially, as you kind of iterate between the solutions and problems and solution and problems to reach an idea that can be developed, there is an opportunity for narratives to be developed. And narratives are like rationales that kind of follow alongside solutions. And once the designer feels as if the rationale, the narrative, is being coherent and is kind of turning out good, they place a lot of confidence in the narrative rather than in the solution. So what they see the narrative to be like, if the narrative feels good, then there is less inclination to detect problems and collect more information. And the feeling of confidence in the narrative can replace the confidence in the solution. And in that way, even when there is low quantity and quality of the information supporting that particular solution, that might not be noticed because the narrative feels good. To kind of add more clarity about what I'm describing, here is a few examples. And these examples happen very frequently. And they didn't just happen to design-led companies. That's what I wanted to highlight. It also happened to companies that were not particularly design-led. So this particular architect describes how they chose this idea. They wanted their building to be surreal like a slug and sit on the plane of the side. This is the idea they wanted to develop. So they started to develop this building. They had bands of cladding around the building. And then as they developed it further and further, they found out that, well, this wouldn't work because it would only work if the ground was flat, but it wasn't. So they had a lot of trouble because then they found out, well, maybe potentially this design, this solution is not even feasible anymore. This also happened to the other example. They proposed something with brick bonds and it would only work if the site was flat. Otherwise, you're losing about 100 bedrooms. And it also happened in collaboration, which I think is quite important because it is not just something that happens to one individual designer. It can also happen in collaboration where A10 and A1 respectively didn't notice that there was a gas pipe and an electricity cable running under the site. And then they described that when they were working on their projects, everything was progressing very quickly. They felt a lot of pressure, but they also felt reassured from their colleagues and the project manager. No one highlighted that they haven't requested the surveys. And then when they did find out that it wasn't there because they had to submit it for planning and it was one of the requirements, they had to kind of cut the building in half and it was built looking totally odd. So when it comes to kind of how did the designers reach the point where they feel like they're satisfied with the information supporting their particular solution? And that quite often is through the process of substitution. So instead of deliberating and thinking very carefully, well, have I done enough analysis? Have I collected enough information? They may draw on easier questions such as, what did the planners want? What did the client want? Or benchmark against a project that already has planning permission, which is a good approach, but there needs to be a consideration that some of these individuals, they have different values. So for example, the planners may not always look for the things that the designer might need at the initial stage that need to consider, because the planners might be more focused on the site area, for example. So I developed a bit of a model. I'll go very quickly. So I talked about the iterative process to reach an idea, to select an idea, and it goes between solution and solution and problem till you choose something. And then you constantly test them. You test them, well, have I reached there? But the more confidence there is in the narrative, the less likely that the iteration will continue, unless there are issues that are identified in a given solution through knowledge. So if an individual or a group of people has enough knowledge to be able to detect problems, they'll be able to redetect them and override any issues. If not, then the solution is chosen until proven wrong. It is always the solution that is tested, not the information behind the solution. So when new information arrives through the project, when there is enough money to do that, it is always the solution which is tested, not the information once again. So even if there were things that didn't quite work, they might not be noticed because you're constantly injecting, well, with this new information, does my idea still work? And so you might continuously repeat errors or not even detect errors. And yeah, that's what I wanted to share to you about selection of design and where potentially I might care.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, that's got my brain spinning, and I'm sure a few of you are the same. So I think there's some. Well, firstly, thank you for that. That was fascinating. Secondly, there's some really interesting comments in the chat box as well that I've seen added throughout. So I will encourage you all to keep an eye on the chat box. So I'm just going to attempt to sum up what I think I heard. Then some of the key points. So I think one of the key points was, we make decisions based on this idea of cognitive ease. We feel comfortable that the decision is right. And there might be various psychological reasons why, but we feel cognitive ease if things feel okay in our brain. And I think I heard you explain that there were a couple of things that could contribute to that. And one of them was this imagined narrative. So it's like our idea of what it should be like. And it sounds like at the start of the design process, often there is an imagined narrative of, I know what I think this is going to be like. And if our decisions align with that imagined story, then we feel comfortable with it. So that's the first one, is the imagined narrative. And then the second one is how we respond to peer feedback. If people around us are sort of giving the impression that everything's okay, then maybe we will ignore evidence to the contrary and we'll go, well, they all seem to think it's okay, so I think it's okay. So I'll just let you come back to me, Diana. Do you think that's reasonable, how I've summed that up? Have I misunderstood anything there?
No, that sounds reasonable. Cognitive ease and imagined narrative and peer feedback. But at the same time, we're ultimately very, very lazy, and peer feedback feels good and easy, and that's fine. And we want to do easy when we're under pressure and working in a busy building industry. And it also gives us reassurance, which is what sometimes people need. Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting observation, that it's easy, because we, if we were digging a hole, then it's quite obvious that we might take a shortcut because it's hard work and we want to do it the easy way. But actually thinking is hard work as well. And so maybe in exactly the same way that if you're operatives on a site, you might try and do things the easy way, there is the risk that the same thing might apply in design. An interesting observation. Okay, well, we're going to basically, I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to ask, I think Helena, who's on the call, to put you into breakout groups for 6 minutes. And what I'd like you to do, please, is to, in your breakout groups, just to discuss, can you think of a situation where designers have found cognitive ease, even though a design is flawed? So basically, can you think of a time when people have been comfortable with the design, even though the design is wrong? And you might think of examples where actually the original story that people had told themselves wasn't really appropriate, or where collectively people were giving feedback, and so they were collectively reassuring each other. I saw a comment about groupthink in a way, where the groupthink had dragged them through. So when you go into your breakout groups, please pick one person who is going to type your answers into the chat box when we come back together and is willing to speak. And then see if you can just think of examples where you've seen people being comfortable with the design, even though it's flawed, and maybe unpick why that was the case. So I will stop sharing and ask Helena to put you into your breakout groups. Okay, so the question you were hopefully discussing was, can you think of a situation where designers have found cognitive ease, even though a design is flawed? So basically, a time when people were carrying on happily, feeling comfortable with the design, even though it was wrong. Maybe they shouldn't have. So can I ask you, please, whoever's your nominated typist, please put your answer into the chat box, and then we'll hear from a few of you once you've typed your answers in. But everyone, please type your answer into the chat box to the question you were discussing. Can you think of a time? So yes, that's a good answer. Thanks. I should have asked I shouldn't have asked a closed question. There's someone who's been to one of my previous webinars and has pulled me up on it. I'll come back to you. Jordan, I'm going to call you up on that. Yes. What is your example, Jordan?
Brilliant.
Just unmute myself. Yes, it's a long story, and I think to try and summarize it inside a chat window wouldn't really do it justice, because I think it's important to sort of state first that no particular party is kind of guilty of it. But just the word cognitive ease, I think it's the lack of resistance on the project I'm currently working on that's kind of going into stage 4 design at the moment, or REBA stage 4 as we call it, has been brought on by repeat business. The same contractors and same designers have all been involved on a project now that's previously been delivered, a very similar project. And a problem that I've found within that is that the CAD company, the computer-aided design company that are producing the drawings within the design, have started using things like templates sort of have a template for, we get technical, kind of like how a pump skid works or how boilers work. And the templates, they're kind of like the latest revision of templates on the software upload. But what has happened is it's brought in lots of change because you've got instrumentation and devices and things like that that have been, let's just say they've been added into design, not necessarily within the written specification, but by way of being added onto the schematics. It's created this new amount of quantum. I don't particularly blame the CAD company because I think that their specialism is to create the drawings, not necessarily mark up or critique them from a technical perspective. That should be down to the consultant in charge of the services. But I do think because everything went so easy in the first project and it was very successful amongst the parties, it's almost been a bit relaxed on the delivery of these drawings now, and it's created a massive delta. You know, we're going back to the client because it's taken a few hurdles for this to jump through before we've taken it back up to the market, and the supply chain have come back with bigger costs now. And it all stems back from using template functions on a computer-aided design program.
Okay, that's really interesting, that observation, that project going well a few times and then you start locking in processes. Diana, have you got any thoughts on that? How does that reflect your research?
Yeah, I talk a lot about fluency and repeatability. Like quite often, once you do something once or two, three times, you develop some sort of fluency and repeatability, and it all feels good. And you don't challenge these decisions anymore because they feel good. And you feel like you've built a repertoire of very successful things. But if these things don't come back with some feedback, and that's often very difficult, especially when you think about initial design decisions, and feedback's miles away from being anywhere close to being realized, you keep repeating the same errors over and over again. You might even share them as precedent and be like, oh, look at this, it's great. But you don't know that actually is not. And yeah.
That's really interesting. So I think there were two things you said there that I thought were really interesting. One was what it feels like. It feels good. You know, people feel happy with it. If it was a brand new project team and someone went, here you go, here's a photocopy of what I did before, maybe you wouldn't feel happy about it. But going, oh, I've done this 5 times before and here's the photocopy, suddenly we feel different. And I think the other thing that was a very nice segue, Diana, so thank you for that, was feedback. How are we getting feedback on what we're doing? Please keep adding your comments in the chat box. We're very squashed for time, so I'm going to go on. But that was the final bit we're going to look at now, is the fourth of these points for how we can think of design a bit like evolution. So we had the first one, heredity, carrying forward things that worked. And what was just described then, you could say, is maybe heredity blocking out variance. So we're just doing what we've done before, and therefore we're not allowing new options in. We've got to add in new options, the variants, and Diana's given us a great exploration of how we select. But the final point in these elements is this one, repetition. How do we make sure the process is repeated time after time? Well, if we go back to thinking about evolution, it's useful for us to compare different types of creatures. How do they evolve? So if we think about an elephant, it takes an elephant 30 years to have a baby. From being born to having a baby is about 30 years. So for any slight change to happen between generations, it's 30 years. A green fly, it takes about 10 days to reproduce. So that means that for an elephant to change a tiny amount is going to take at least 30 years. And in those 30 years, green fly have the opportunity to change and iterate 1,095 times. So if the situation is changing, if the environment is changing, the food supply, the temperature, whatever it is, if it's changing, for every tiny change an elephant can make, a green fly can change over 1,000 times. So you can quite clearly see which one of those is most likely to adapt if things are different. And another way of thinking about this idea of feedback is, how easy is it to learn to drive a car? Well, actually, it's quite easy. It takes a few months. And that's because at the moment you turn the steering wheel, the car turns. And therefore, you learn that if I turn the wheel this way, it goes here. If I turn the wheel this way, it goes here. Learning to drive an oil tanker takes, I think, about 20 years. And that's because if you turn the wheel, nothing happens for ages. And then if you turn it back, nothing happens. And then you turn it back, nothing happens. And half an hour later, the boat will be waving about all over the place. So it's really, really hard to learn to drive because you haven't got that feedback. So why is that relevant for us? Well, the question really is our design process in construction like driving a car, where we make a decision, we get feedback, we know the consequence of the decision, and then we can change it? Or is it like an oil tanker, where someone makes a decision, and then a different decision, a different decision, a different decision, and then at some point you get some feedback, but you don't even know what the feedback was on? So I'll maybe throw that out to you in the chat box and just say, how can we get feedback in our design process? Anyone, any recommendations? What do you think we can do to improve feedback in our designs? We've already got a comment from Dr. J. Martin about how long is it in a life cycle to accumulate experience with structures being designed very long-lived. Nathan, you've talked about design reviews. Can you maybe comment on those? How you see those implemented and how effective those are?
Yeah, I can. So it's basically the function of my department and what we do design reviews at tender stage and bid stages of jobs to make sure that we've got the risks and opportunities and we're getting the value out of the job that we need to. And then all the way through the design process, we'll do our design reviews. Then we call them end of stage reviews, but inherently you're trying to check things when they're produced, so you're getting on top of the problems early. So yeah, that's generally what we do, and we give the feedback instantly to the design teams and project teams. So yeah, it's built into our processes. It's what we do.
Okay, so that sounds like a really powerful process, those design reviews. And I'm just wondering, do those get feedback from things that are built, or is that feedback amongst designers, or does it have both?
A bit of both, really. We're there all the way through to the end. So we will do walkarounds on site as well to check what's being installed. And then there's usually a wrap up at the end of stage 5 when we're doing things like our EPCs and final record drawings and doing a little wash up of the project as well. So we do get learning from the end of the project.
Great, thank you. And Robert, I can see you've put an interesting comment here. You said, not that I've seen it, which is probably key, but regular collaboration achieved between design representatives and the contractors and further down through the suppliers subcontractor chain. Okay, interesting that you say it would be useful, but you've not seen it. Right, we are rapidly approaching the end. Some really fascinating comments in the chat box. I wish we had another hour to talk, but I'm going to wrap up there, attempt to be on time, and I will hand back to Cliff for the final words. So Cliff, back to you.
Nick, can I just pick you up on that? I have seen that collaboration between.
Great. Okay. Sorry. I thought. Yeah. Great.
That
has been.
Voice,
I don't know why.
Well done.
Sorry.
You found your voice.
Yeah, it was something to do with the cable. I don't know what the connector into the computer. I have no idea what. But yes, I've seen it, and can achieve fantastic things. I know. Right. I ran some major site investigations, and we're talking about $1 million, $1.5 million each. And we got fantastic collaboration between the contractor and ourselves. I get a phone call at home over the weekend. This test isn't going right. What do you want me to do with it? You know, that he's not obliged to do that, but that was the relationship we achieved.
That sounds excellent. Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you. No, great. Thanks for jumping in. Cliff.
Thanks, Nick. I think I picked up that this subject's got a lot of breadth to it, and there's a lot of opinions and views, which is exactly what I was talking about at the beginning, about being thought-provoking, and not sticking with what we already know, but being open to new ideas and thinking about what we're doing. I'm quite keen on that early point that was made about having some sort of facilitated effort at the incorporation of innovation and wider thinking. So right at the beginning of the project, when you've got your first ideas perhaps coming through, then get something facilitated to look at the wider picture, listening to others, you know, 2 ears, 1 mouth, and all that sort of come back. And we talked about diversity of thought. All these things are very important during the opening up stage. And I think lessons learned also, we picked up towards the end there. Quite often we learn a lesson on one project and we can collaborate around it through our various exchanges that Richard talked about and phone calls in the middle of the night. The issue is, do those lessons learned go on to the next project? In my experience, we have like volumes of lessons learned that go on a shelf when you've finished one job, but how many people then really look at that and use it on the next one? So lessons are very important. So that was my thinking. That's what I picked up from today, and I hope you've all got something to take away from our webinar. And we've got another one in a few weeks' time, so look out for that. And you know, if there are any queries or issues that you would like to talk to us about, you can get in contact with us through the GIRI website, and we'll pass on your questions to Nick or Diana and come back to you. So thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you very much to our speakers.